life. Now, before we go there, I want to use the Apostle Paul, try to help us with an idea about, because I know I run the risk. See, I'm wading out into waters sometimes, and I'm moving out into a little deeper waters, and I really just try to follow the Spirit where I feel like He's leading me to go in this. As long as we get to the end and Jesus look good, then I look back on it and go, okay, we can work with that. I don't listen to a lot of other people, so I don't even sometimes know the trend or where stuff's going. So I also try to train myself to slow down in those moments where I feel like I just took you out into the deeper end of the pool, and put a little scripture behind that, and maybe help us to see something differently than we've seen it before. So I made a big one there when I said you got this theme of Cain's killing Abel and 11 brothers against Joseph, and now you got the law. So what I did was I made law sound like Cain, and he sounds like the bad guy. And I want to be careful there. But I also want to be true to what I think the New Testament Christian writers, looking back on the law, I want to be true to what I think they saw that it had done to them. Okay? What it had done to them as people, what it had done to them as the family of God, and what it stood a risk of doing to anybody who went back into the law now that they had come into grace. And so Paul dances that fine line better than anybody, because Paul's this guy who, as Saul, has just a head full of law. He knows all of it. Well, then he has an encounter with the living Christ on the road to Damascus. He begins to preach grace. He's ostracized by everybody because nobody trusts him. I mean, how do you know he's not just a subversive coming in to try to get on the inside and kill you from the inside? So Paul's never really trusted. So Paul it's almost to his advantage that nobody really bothers him, because then he gets to just preach radical grace without having to ask everybody if they agree with it, and if it works, then they're all going to be forced to agree. And that's kind of what Paul does. In fact, they shipped Paul off for years right out of the gate, because he was too radical for them. And when he comes back, they're like, man, this guy's got something. Well, here's a little part of what Paul had. Look at Romans 7. Start in verse 7. I'm not going to get into the argument of whether this is pre-salvation Paul, post-salvation Paul. I think it's pretty clear. Just watch how Paul talks. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Stop before you read any further. Why in the world would Paul ask this question? And so I think the fact that Paul has to say, is the law sin, means that Paul has been hammering down on, hey, over here in the dark side of this equation is a little thing called Moses and the law. And over here, I've met him, is a guy named Jesus. And he preached that so fervently that he feels the need to stop and go, well, is the law sin? Can you imagine Saul asking that question? It wouldn't even enter his vernacular. And even though this was in my Bible for most of my ministry life, I wouldn't have asked this question. Because, of course, the law is not sin. I mean, you ought to be doing your best to keep the law. That's what I would have told you at one time. Right? I mean, even though I had this scripture the whole time too. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known what covetousness was unless the law had said, you shall not covet. Well, that's interesting. I mean, in other words, the law defined my issues. It put definition to the stuff I was going through. Paul picks an interesting one, covetousness, basically lust. So Paul goes, I wouldn't have even thought anything of having lust. I mean, lust is just a part of life, right? Yes. Correct answer. Lust is just a part of life. But there's a part of lust that's not just an acceptable part of life. Paul goes, I wouldn't have known there was anything to that if I hadn't been introduced to the fact that thou shalt not covet. Verse 8. But sin took opportunity by commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. Now, I already had lust. That's a natural part of being alive. But the law, which told me my lust was off limits, started to stir in me the desire to do stuff, some of which I hadn't even really thought about doing before, until you said, don't do it. And boy, doesn't that sound like us. So, I didn't even have a problem with that until you said, don't do that. And the minute you said, don't do that, all I wanted to do, at least try it, was that. I don't know what that is. I don't even know if I would enjoy that. But you told me I wouldn't like it, and I'm here to prove you wrong. There you go, well, that's not us, but yes, it is. That's kind of how we've lived our entire lives. You're just moving towards those manners of evil desires. For apart from the law, this is interesting. Apart from the law, sin was dead. I mean, I was alive once without it. When the commandment came, sin revived, I died. There's so much good theology there. I only want to take so much time to deal with it, and that's to say this. Paul's dealing with a moment in his life where at least, and I personally think that Paul could be talking about Paul, not Saul, having been freed and then was reintroduced to the law for righteousness. I don't know this for sure. Paul might be talking about little Saul, just little tyke, before he went to Pharisee school, because he did. And in Pharisee school, you memorize the Pentateuch by the time you're 12, which tells me that Paul knew thou shalt not covet right around age 12. So either Paul's talking about 11-year-old Saul, or Paul's talking about 40-year-old Paul, who got freed from the law, and then someone in his family called him off to the side and said, if you want to be a good Jew, you ought to be doing this still. I don't know. I know they're both relevant. Either little 11-year-old Saul getting introduced to don't, or 40-plus-year-old Paul getting reintroduced to, hey, God's going to be mad at you if you do that. In either way, Paul said, you know what, I was doing okay. I love that phrase in verse 9. I was alive once without the law. I was actually living my life. Then the law came. The commandment came, sin revived, I died, and the commandment, now watch this, which was meant to bring life, I found it to bring death. For sin took occasion by the commandment, sin deceived me, it killed me, therefore the law is holy, the commandment is holy, it's just and it's good. Almost seems like a backpedal. Let's get to the end of that passage. It goes, therefore, the law is holy. You expect him to go, therefore, the law isn't holy. Should chuck the law. No, Paul runs the other way. He goes, therefore, the problem is not really with the law. The problem is with my approach to the law. And what's missing in my approach to the law? Well, it won't make me righteous. It exposes my sin. It produces in me all manner of evil desires. Takes a guy who's alive and makes him dead. I don't think it was meant to do anything for me in terms of righteousness, and I think that's what Paul starts to discover. And he goes, the law's not the problem, I am. I'm incapable of doing this. I don't have the ability to do what the law tells me to do. I need something else in order to live again. What do I need? So John says, John 1:17, the law was given by Moses. Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Now, John is post-Paul. Remember this. What you're reading in John 1:17 is not pre-Apostle Paul. It's post-Apostle Paul. John writes this after Paul. In fact, Paul's probably dead and has been perhaps for decades. The gospel of grace that Paul introduced, which is really the foundation of Christianity as John knows it, is what John's building off of. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't touch this. They write during or prior to the ministry of Paul. They don't touch the bright contrast between the darkness of the law and the brightness of grace. John does. Why? Because he's on the other side of Pauline theology. And on the other side of Pauline theology, here's the idea in the church. The law was misused. The law wasn't supposed to make people righteous, but we thought it was. And we propped it up as a means to get to God. And it wasn't a means to get to God. It was a means by which God helped corral and control us under the old covenant. And now that we're in the new covenant, why would we ever go back to that? We have something better. They had a form of grace, but we have grace and truth. And I don't think we should just lower that to this idea that grace and truth are just the man Jesus, because it is more than that.